Hi everyone. My name is Zack Mulcare, and I'm a research project coordinator at the VIPC at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Today, I will be talking a bit about the work that we do, how we came to find Sample Manager, and how we're using it to meet our needs. So first of all, who are we? As Steve said, we're the Viral Immunity and Pathogenesis Center. We're a collaborative group of 10 PI-led laboratories that share a lab space and work together on similar research goals. Overall, we study the human immune response to varying viral infections, such as hepatitis C, hepatitis B, HIV, SARS-CoV-2, and RSV. The lab that I work for primarily studies hepatitis C, followed by RSV. We're not doing a lot of work with SARS-CoV-2 anymore, but our lab was the COVID biorepository for all of Johns Hopkins, and we processed and stored samples from 10 different COVID studies between 2020 and 2022. So to give a bit of background on why we're studying hepatitis C virus, or HCV, is a bloodborne virus that infects the liver, causing the infection hepatitis C. There is a subset of individuals, about 25%, who spontaneously clear their HCV infection within the first 6 months. The remaining 75%, however, persist to chronic infection. And to give just some stats, hepatitis C overall, according to the World Health Organization, an estimated 50 million people have chronic hepatitis C globally, with about 1 million new infections occurring per year. And in 2022, just over 240,000 people worldwide died from hepatitis C, mostly from cirrhosis and liver cancer. Hepatitis C is curable through treatment with direct-acting antiviral medication. However, cost and access to treatment and diagnosis is low. Additionally, acute HCV is typically asymptomatic, so most individuals do not know they are infected until chronic, more serious issues arise. Ultimately, a vaccine is needed to fully eradicate this infection, and that's kind of where our lab's focus comes in. So we study the individuals who spontaneously clear their HCV infections, hoping to understand how their immune system is doing this, and with the goal to hopefully be able to prime that same immune response in others via a vaccine. So I'll talk briefly now about how we're actually doing that research, and that is through the BBASH cohort. So BBASH stands for the Baltimore Before and After Acute Study of Hepatitis. It is a prospective cohort study of people who inject drugs in the Baltimore area. The study existed as early as the late 90s. However, the focus for studying and tracking HCV infections did not start until the early 2000s. Participants are enrolled only if they've never been infected with HCV, and they can come in once a month for a peripheral blood draw. That blood is then processed into plasma, serum, and PBMCs. We test some of the plasma for HCV antibody and HCV RNA levels to determine if someone becomes infected, and then we store everything else for long-term use. For those who do become infected, we continue to follow up monthly and track their infection to see the outcome. Anyone who can spontaneously clear their infection are then studied in a lot more detail. In addition to just the HCV testing we perform, the participants also have access to HIV testing, clean needle programs, and other resources for substance use. And if they do become infected with HCV, they have access to DAA treatment, all paid for by the study. So before I get into how we're using Sample Manager, I want to give some background on the size of our biorepository and the challenges we were facing that brought us to Sample Manager in the first place. So in our biorepository, we have just under 300,000 individual samples from 15 distinct studies. The oldest sample in our freezers is dated to 1997, which is older than I am, actually. But that is a fun fact my older coworkers prefer I keep to myself. In terms of freezers, our biorepository takes up 8 -80s and 7 LN2s. But in total, across all the PIs, our lab has 16 -80s and 10 LN2s. So alongside just all the freezers and samples, the kind of prior freezer management software we had before transitioning to Sample Manager had several issues. First, it was fairly dated. To my knowledge, our lab had been using the software as long as we'd been collecting and storing samples for, but the most recent version we had was dated to 2018. Its functionality, however, was very clunky and did not offer much more than just using an Excel file would. Second, the software and our biorepository records were not managed well historically in our lab. This is mostly due to a lack of centralized oversight as our group grew larger over the years. Additionally, over the 20 or so years our biorepository has existed, there have been dozens of different people who have interacted with it in varying capacities. And this is just a classic case of having too many cooks in the kitchen. So these two reasons were primarily why I began looking to upgrade our freezer management software. But the third and final reason is what kind of put our lab on a deadline to either upgrade our software to a newer version or transition our biorepository entirely. And that is because our software was hosted on a single computer in the lab. And this only became an issue because around the end of 2023, when we first started talks with Sample Manager and transitioning, we were notified by Hopkins that they were updating all computers at the institution to Windows 11 in late 2024, early 2025. And both the software we were using and the computer it was hosted on were so old that they were not compatible with Windows 11, meaning we would be dead in the water if we did not find a solution. So how do we initially plan to fix this? We thought it would be a pretty simple fix, just update the software and buy a new computer. But seeing as I'm now giving this talk about Sample Manager, you can correctly assume that this solution was not, in fact, this simple. So it quickly became clear that upgrading our prior software would be impossible for us. The first reason was because the software company we were using entirely moved away from standalone versions of the software and shifted towards cloud-hosted servers. And this was only an issue because they did not host their own servers. So the entire cost of setting up and maintaining a server was entirely on us. In addition to that, the actual cost of upgrading was way too high. So to update to the newest edition of the version we had been using for years with the same functionality, in addition to the cost of the maintaining and setting up a server, we were quoted a one-time cost of $54,000 with an additional $11,500 per year in maintenance and support. And the maintenance support was actually required in order for us to transfer our records to the new version. And then the one cheaper option available to us was $15,000 with a $4,500 per year in maintenance support. But this would be a downgrade to a version with less functionality than what our lab had been using for over 20 years. So neither option presented was doable for us. So I began looking for alternatives, which eventually brought us to Sample Manager. So why did we pick Sample Manager overall? And there are several reasons why we decided on Sample Manager. The first was the cost. LabKey's model to pay per user login was very appealing to us. So even though we're such a large group, not everyone needs direct access to our biorepository. Additionally, the maintenance and support being included in the cost was a huge appeal given to what we were quoted before. Second was the improved functionality. So the most appealing improvement was the lineage organization of data within Sample Manager. As I mentioned before, we collect peripheral blood, but the actual samples that we're storing in our freezers are the derivatives of that peripheral blood. So we collect it, but then our lab processes it into plasma, serum, and PBMC. So having the ability to track multiple sample types and derive one from another, that vastly improved the clarity of our biorepository. Additionally, the audit log and tracking is far more detailed and much easier to access than what we were used to. And the ability to search and filter by any data field was also just much better. And then the third and final reason we went with Sample Manager was the assistance that was offered with transferring our data. Due to the scale and size of our biorepository, we did not take transitioning it lightly. Additionally, we were still actively processing and collecting new samples every day. So we needed as little or ideally zero downtime. So having our data transfer be handled entirely by Lance and Hannah allowed this to happen. Thanks again to you both for all of that hard work and assistance you provided with that. So now I'll go over how I've organized Sample Manager in our lab and the ways that we're using it day to day. So to give a quick overview on what is coming into our lab currently on a day-to-day basis, we're processing blood from 3 different studies, BBASH, which I already discussed, STRIVE, which is studying responses to RSV vaccination in immunocompromised individuals, and our non-human primate vaccination study, which is testing a novel HCV vaccine in rhesus macaques. So to give some insight on the number of samples that we're processing, in 2025, we processed a total of 738 peripheral blood samples, from which we had a total of 8,970 samples enter our -80s and 4,573 samples enter our LN2s. In Q1 of this year, we processed 211 so far, and we stored 2,913 samples into -80s and 1,178 into LN2s. So Juggling multiple studies with differing needs is the biggest challenge I face in kind of setting up and organizing our sample manager instance. So the actual processing that we do in the lab does not really differ in any way between the studies, but each study has a different need for number of aliquots, the volume of those aliquots that we're creating, and then also just the different sample types we're actually collecting. So there's some overlap, but no two studies are exactly the same. So I'll briefly walk through our kind of source and sample types that we're using the two HCV studies as an example. So the inclusion of pathogen study as a source type above the cohorts themselves allows us to kind of easily filter off and silo entirely unrelated samples from studies that we're not, focusing on in whatever search we're doing. After the cohort comes the participant, which is contains information such as the infection status or vaccination status, depending on the cohort. And then we have the first sample type of peripheral blood, which stores all of the information relevant to sample collection. Most importantly, the visit date and visit code. But this would also be a place where if was a bad draw and we didn't get enough as many tubes as we normally get, if something happens during processing, this is the place that kind of those comments exist as well. And then our final sample types are the kind of three blood derivatives, plasma, serum, and PBMC, each being their own sample type. And while this isn't a true sample type, when I include the aliquots of each of the blood derivatives, you can see the differences between our studies just at a quick glance. So specifically their final volume and number of aliquots and which sample type are collected. Like in our NHPV study, we don't get serum at all. And here's a view of the lineage grid directly from Sample Manager for a dummy participant I created for this talk. It's important to note that the only samples in this view that actually exist in our freezers as individual vials are the ones at the bottom row, just the final aliquots. So we needed a way to differentiate between those physical samples in our freezers for finding locations and how to use it for the tests that we needed. And then also the records that we were still creating that contained the kind of important information about the collection and processing and the sample overall. So the way that we resolved this was with the addition of a primary sample status. So having this status allows any sample with the status of available to designate that it is truly a physical sample in one of our freezers. And those with the primary sample are just the ones that are records and have the information. So kind of going back to the lineage view here, these are the samples that are the ones that get the status of available. They exist in our freezers and we know and can interact with them and search for them to pool and make pick lists and requests to use. And then these are the samples that get the status of primary sample, indicating that they are just records containing important information about the sample or the collection itself. And then finally, I'll kind of talk about our daily workflow with Sample Manager, specifically how we easily handle importing samples from these different studies. So just as a quick reminder, here's kind of what we're looking at from top down any given day. And then on any given day, we need to create everything here at once. So in addition to having kind of multiple samples from different studies in a single day, it is extremely uncommon for us to only have one sample from any given study coming in as well. We typically are processing at least 2 samples up to 8 or 9 is not uncommon. So to avoid having to kind of create numerous samples manually, I've created a custom Excel template for each of our cohorts that contains the appropriate number of aliquots and at the correct volumes for each study. So our technicians only need to input the sample ID, visit code, and visit date for each sample into the appropriate template. And then they just save that file and upload it into Sample Manager using the import from file feature. So here's a short video just kind of showing that in action using that dummy placement I showed earlier in the lineage grid. And this was one of the templates that I exported from the sample type. So all of the kind of fields here to the right are the fields that appropriately match the sample types and maintain the lineage that matches what we want. And then, yeah, I just wanted to wrap up with kind of my final thoughts on Sample Manager after we've been using it for 2 years in the lab. So our lab's ability to search and find samples within our freezers has vastly improved directly due to the increased clarity the lineage organization provides. Additionally, we've been able to much more readily identify and correct errors within our biorepository, both minor daily errors such as typos and those kind of more historical issues that I briefly touched on earlier. And then the built-in pick lists have been a massive boon for a larger group like us. Like most labs, our demand kind of ebbs and flows, but at our busiest, we can have up to 10 graduate students and staff members requesting samples from different cohorts in the biorepository at once. So having the ability to have a built-in pick list to track which samples are already checked out, which are being kind of requested or looked at, and by who, makes it a lot easier to really know what's coming in and out. And it's a lot easier than just juggling a bunch of different emails in different formats from different people asking for things or requesting things. And then the support provided by LabQ team has been super quick, extremely helpful, no matter how big or small our questions are. And lastly, the kind of creating and entering samples, printing labels, and storing them into our freezers has just been much easier and faster since switching over to Sample Manager. And it's really just been a fantastic experience and an addition to our lab overall. So quick thank yous and a picture of my lab. Of course, thank you PI Andrea and lab managers John and Nikki, who've always supported and assisted all the work that I do. And thank you again to the LabQ team for the opportunity to present and kind of share here. And of course, all the help you provided getting us up and running. Lance has been pivotal and kind of the go-to person to help with assisting with everything. Hannah's been very involved as well. Jason, thanks for all the getting kind of us set up and kind of the early contracts, and Tori for kind of everything with getting this presentation together. So yeah, thank you. If there's any questions, I can answer them.
Thank you so much, Zach. We really appreciate it. It's always great hearing. We do have a couple of questions, so let's see. With such high incoming and outgoing sample throughput, do you ever do random inventory checking to see kind of are things being accurately input, like cycle counting or anything like that?
We do in the kind of freezer that's active in where we're storing like what's kind of being actively processed. There's less of like a random check in our kind of older historical freezers, but we try to keep on top of the kind of one that we're actively in and out of a lot.
And then how do you record who has removed or received samples?
Just remove samples. Um, we have an SOP that kind of wrote, so once someone kind of makes their pick list, we ask them that they kind of email myself and the lab managers kind of formalizing, like export that pick list to Excel. And then we check back up. I believe it's after 48 hours, if depending on the day of the week that they send out the request, kind of make sure that everything went fine with that pick list and pool, and then that everything kind of got updated correctly in Sample Manager, whether it's placed back because there's only and like freeze thaw increased, or if it's been discarded or whatever's needed.
And then they're asking, it's since you've imported such a old biorepository, were there any major hurdles with the data associated with those samples? How did you overcome that?
There were a lot of hurdles. I think that there was had to be dozens of emails from even just back and forth with Lance about, hey, we found this weird thing, or what is going on with these samples. It was really just a slow and steady process. I think it probably was about 3 or 4 months of probably the first two were just myself trying to export everything and really take my time with it and make sure everything was correct. And then probably another 2 months with working directly with kind of Lance having his hands on it. And then us kind of back and forth. There was a good, I think, month time where we were meeting either weekly or every other week, Lance, during that transition. Yeah, I slow and steady. They're really just making sure that working through sections, trying not to repeat what's going on. And the biggest thing that helped us is we kind of started one study at a time rather than trying to go freezer by freezer. Because we do have freezers that have samples from different studies. I found it easier to kind of go by each study because then I could worry about the important information for each study at each given time and what is things are supposed to look like, what visit codes are supposed to exist in this data field, things like that.
And then another question we have is, since you have grad students, it seems like coming in and out, how do you go about training new users to the system? Do you have resources that you use?
Yeah, so really anyone kind of coming in, that's there is a more kind of formalized uh, onboarding and that the managers handle in the lab in general. But in terms of freezers, they get given all the SOPs and really anyone like I kind of just go and personally talk to and sit down about the kind of projects they're going to be coming into and what they're working on and what studies they may need in the future. And then really it's kind of just a process that I kind of sit down and show them how sample manager is kind of oriented and works kind of go through those SOPs with everybody and then also physically pull samples with them until they're show the ability to properly use and pull from freezers without causing any issues.
And then another question we have is, how have importing samples or studies into Sample Manager change over time? So I guess have you changed your processes?
um I think not extensively. There's definitely been some times where I've kind of updated the template that we're using to kind of match kind of some shifting study needs. Usually, if it's kind of to create like, for example, like additional plasma aliquots at lower volumes, I think is a common change I kind of use with studies. And it's usually because either ourselves or a collaborator as once sample collection starts, kind of recognizes that they need some regular use of 200 microliters for whatever assay they're doing for the study. So I'll kind of update our templates to make a few extra, but not really extensively. I try to really make sure everything's organized. Kind of those questions are asked to kind of avoid having to entirely upend and redo kind of the organization.
And I think one last question, unless anyone else gets them in, what kind of functions or features are you using to search through your inventory when people make requests?
I think the Sample Finder is probably the biggest one that we use, both from the searching for samples to pool and actually from like our daily technicians who process the blood. We have some saved searches that essentially like is samples created today with the added source type of whatever cohort that we're using. So today's B-Bash samples, that way we can very quickly see what we're processing. And then the rest of that would probably be a mix of um, for like VBASH, for example, all of the participants have their overall HCV infectivity status as a field attached to like the participant source type. So if someone is chronically infected, if they're searching for samples from chronically infected people, if they're searching for samples from our spontaneously cleared individuals, mostly, yeah, the sample finder is probably our go-to. And then sometimes it's also like kind of the bulk search by ID. And that's usually if someone's kind of already gone through a research database and identified exactly who and what time points they want, they'll kind of go in the bulk ID search.
Cool. And then it looks like we have one other question. Does your team use mobile devices like tablets or anything with Sample Manager, or are they all
We
desktop?
do not.
Okay,
We do not.
cool. That's what I thought you were doing too. So awesome.